When the Republic collapsed and gave way to the Galactic Empire at the end of the Clone Wars, the greatest travesty committed by Emperor Palpatine wasn't the destruction of the Jedi Order, but the rapid decommissioning of the Republic Navy. The galaxy was at peace finally, and also in complete ruins. The citizens of the Empire needed aid and relief, not more military spending. Yet within 5 years of Order 66, the mighty Venator Class Star Destroyer was already being retired, giving way to the much larger and heavily armed Imperial Class Star Destroyer. Today I want to take a look at these two iconic Star Destroyers and explain to you guys why the older version isn't always the worst version. It takes no genius to figure out that the Venator would not stand a chance against an Imperial class in a broadside exchange at very close range. As a matter of fact, I'm not even sure if the Venator's classification is correct. Or perhaps the Venator is a destroyer, but the Imperial class is not. It's truly a battleship. Designed and built by Quat Drive Yards, the Venator class's primary role was ship-to-ship combat, with a secondary role as a starfighter carrier. In a larger fleet, it could be used as a military transport or even an escort for a battleship. This was a multi-purpose vessel that was designed by manufacturers who were unsure of what kind of threats would present itself in the future. In our last video, we talked about how the Tarkin Doctrine poisoned the mindset of all Imperial military designers. This was especially noticeable with Imperial naval ship designs. You see, Tarkin wasn't loved as a child, so he grew up with a pretty twisted view of the world. He believed that the only way he could control people was by using fear. This mentality was responsible for the creation of both Death Stars, which wasted tons of resources on a tactically impressive weapon that was strategically useless. The Imperial Class Star Destroyer was also the result of the Tarkin Doctrine mindset. This vessel was almost 500 meters longer than the Venator Class Star Destroyer, but even more impressive was the fact that it had 60 heavy turbolaser batteries, 6 dual heavy turbolaser batteries, 2 quad heavy turbolasers, and more than 60 ion cannons. The Venator Class Star Destroyer only had 8 dual heavy turbo laser turrets and 50 to 60 point defense cannons. These ships are clearly designed for different roles and purposes. Again, the Venator would not stand a chance in a close-range broadside exchange. As a matter of fact, maybe 5 Venators wouldn't even stand a chance against one single Imperial Class Star Destroyers if they're only using their turbo lasers. But that's only if the Venator class is willing to play the Imperial Class Star Destroyer's game, which a smart Republic captain would most certainly avoid. In our previous video comparing the clone troopers to the stormtroopers, we noticed that most of the GAR motor pool is very compatible with one another. Vehicles like the AT-TE were quite powerful alone, but if you add an LAAT carrier to the mix along with some AT-RTs, you expand the mobility and firepower of these walkers, which of course improves the survivability and the effectiveness of the clone platoon deployed with it. The Republic approached their naval doctrine in a very similar way when they were designing their ships. Everything in the Republic Navy was integrated and based around the Venator Class Star Destroyer. The ship's true classification should be as an assault carrier, or a heavily armed or armored ship that mainly relies on deploying starfighters for its offensive and defensive capabilities, but should it run into some close-range combat, it should also be able to hold its own for a while, much better than a traditional carrier would. The Venator Class Star Destroyer could carry several hundred starfighters inside of its massive hangar, which actually ran the length of the entire ship. This could be accessed either through the long thin opening that ran across the top of the ship or the 2 small gates on the side of the ship. Lastly, you had a large docking bay below the ship as well that could fit a Republic frigate if necessary. This means that the Venator Class Star Destroyer could deploy its entire contingent of fighters relatively quickly and from almost every direction, which can be really useful during close broadside exchanges. You don't want to launch your fighters, for instance, directly into the line of fire of an enemy ship. The Imperial Class Star Destroyer, in comparison, could only carry 1 fighter wing on board, or around 72 starfighters, usually 2 squadrons of standard TIEs, and a squadron of bombers or interceptors. The main attack hangar and Imperial class lie below the Star Destroyer. These TIE fighters were very limited in range and capabilities, they didn't have a hyperdrive, and were mainly used for defensive purposes. As a matter of fact, the ISD famously lacked point defense weapons. It was actually the short-range interceptors that would protect the ISD from enemy snub fighters. The Venator Class Star Destroyer's much larger complement of fighters was also much more diverse. The ship could carry single-seat light interceptors like the V-19 Torrent or the ETA Actis. It could also carry fighter bombers like the Y-Wing or medium fighters like the ARC-170. And many of these ships were either hyperdrive equipped or could use hyperspace rings deployed by the Venator, which significantly increased the range of the Venator Class Star Destroyer's striking capabilities. We actually need to think of the Venator Class Star Destroyer as a mobile airbase. It can completely screen or attack enemy fighters before it even exposes itself to any type of return fire. And even at close ranges, a Venator's ability to launch hundreds of fighters in a minute can turn the tide of battle immediately. We see this happen during the Battle of Ryloth. One single Venator Class Star Destroyer, the Resolute, took on 6 Separatist frigates at the same time and won thanks to the quick deployment of several Y-Wings. But this, of course, was less than desirable. You don't want too much damage on your capital ship. Instead, what you want to do is send out your starfighters so they intercept the enemy before they even reach you. And no matter how strong and large an ISD is, it really doesn't stand a chance against a few dozen starfighters equipped with ion and proton torpedoes, let alone the full complement that can be found on board of a Venator Class Star Destroyer. The Venator class should have changed Star Wars naval doctrine in the same way that the Battle of the Pacific during World War II solidified the power of the aircraft carrier, which would replace the battleship as the most important vessel in a modern naval fleet. But no, instead of upgrading or maybe like redesigning the Venator Class Star Destroyer, all of these ships were scrapped, and in its place, Emperor Palpatine ordered 25,000 Imperial Class Star Destroyers. This was done during a relatively peaceful time, mind you, and by the time the Galactic Civil War entered its most conventional warfare period, the ISD's design flaws were beginning to show. During peacetime, there were 2 main limitations with the ISD. One was its limited range. I mean, sure, on board the ISD, you had an entire legion of stormtroopers and their entire vehicle pool, along with a prefabricated base that you could just drop on a planet and occupy. But the ISD could really only be in one place at a time. A task force of ISDs were usually assigned to a sector, but they were generally overkill for whatever peacekeeping mission they were needed for. The second reason why the ISD was a massive liability for the Empire was that it was the most resource-intensive ship in the entire Navy. And I'm not just talking about initial costs and maintenance costs. The Empire also needs a well-established logistical infrastructure to keep these massive vessels operating at peak capacity. I mean, you had over 40,000 crew members and stormtroopers that you had to feed on this thing. When the Emperor died on Endor, the first thing to collapse was this logistical structure. We witnessed several Imperial Class Star Destroyers struggling to operate against the rebellion. The post-Endor ISD oftentimes had multiple systems offline because of a lack of parts or personnel, or a lack in both ammunition and fuel. I guess in Star Wars, the age-old adage that your military force is only as strong as its logistical network still rings true. I've always argued that the Empire could have brought multiple Gazanti-class or Architon-class light cruisers and covered a much wider territory with these smaller ships, while still having enough firepower to deal with whatever trouble they might run into. Or we could just take an old Venator Class Star Destroyer and use that for patrolling an entire sector, a job that it is well suited to do. You could carry out daily sorties with snub fighters to various systems and cover an even wider range than a fleet of Gazantis could. This would greatly increase the footprint of the Imperial military and keep the galaxy much safer. It's always sad seeing awesome machines, whether it's a motorcycle or a Star Destroyer, being wasted in a scrapyard for political or even economic reasons. I believe that Emperor Palpatine made a huge mistake by introducing the Imperial Class Star Destroyer. As cool as that ship was, the Venator Class Star Destroyer was a much better peacetime patrol kind of vessel. Well guys, let me know in the comment section below what you think. Am I wrong, or do you agree with my assessment about both of these starships? Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy.